Do believe we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, and we are here today to debate about what's going to be happening with support towards Ukraine. We have, for the first time, a NAFO member, with the dog, Jonathan Fink of Silicon Curtain Podcast. And we have the knight in gold and black armor himself, the ANCAP Knight, Keith Knight, of the Libertarian Institute. And I believe this is your second or third appearance. I don't remember right now, but it's always a pleasure to have you here. So we're going to just get into this, and I would want to start with Mr. Knight's response to the recent bill that was passed, the funding for Ukraine from the United States government. What you think about that, as well as where exactly do you see this whole thing going? And I know you're on the side of not having any kind of intervention when it comes to Ukraine, and Mr. Fink is the opposite. So, Keith, you've got the floor, and everybody be sure to like, subscribe, need those super chats, click the bell, all that good stuff. Anyway, Keith, take it away, buddy.
The U.S. should not be supporting Ukraine financially in this fight against Russia because this conflict is primarily the cause of NATO expansion, not unprovoked Russian aggression. My case starts with a February 9th meeting in 1990 between James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev, citing from George Washington University archives. Repeating what Bush said at the Malta summit in December 1989, Baker tells Gorbachev, "The president and I have made clear that we seek no unilateral advantage in this process of inevitable German unification." Baker goes on to say, "We understand the need for assurances to countries in the East. If we maintain a presence in Germany that is part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east." Later in conversation, Baker poses the same position as a question: would you prefer a united Germany outside NATO that is independent and has no U.S. forces, or would you prefer a united Germany with ties to NATO and assurances that there would be no extension of NATO's current jurisdiction eastward? Since that meeting in 1990, NATO has expanded to the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Finland, explicitly going back on their word. They expanded NATO just as the U.S. would not tolerate Soviet missiles in Cuba. Ever, Russians are not going to tolerate a military alliance on their border with Petro Poroshenko's government or Vladimir Zelensky's government. This was reiterated in 2008 by then ambassador to Russia, William Burns, later CIA director. He said, "Following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek NATO membership action plan at the Bucharest summit, Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene." In 2014, Senator Chris Murphy went on C-SPAN and said, "I think it was good, our role, including sanctions and threats of sanctions that forced, in part, Yanukovych from office," clearly provoking a response from Russia. Senator Lindsey Graham in 2017 went to Ukraine and said, "Your fight is our fight," speaking to Ukrainian Defense Forces. 2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia. Enough of Russian aggression. It is time for them to pay a heavier price. This conflict is constantly being pushed by U.S. politicians. We Americans should not support it. The people of Ukraine are not benefiting. They are losing tens of thousands of people, millions of men getting conscripted or enslaved to die. This way, we could have someone like Zelensky on the throne in Kiev as opposed to someone like Yanukovych. The debate is not, should everyone in Ukraine be free or should all of them be killed? That is obviously a clear dichotomy of moral and immoral. This case, we are fighting a war thousands of miles away to determine who's going to sit on the throne in either Kiev or who's going to be calling the shots in the Donbass. This is not worth risking a nuclear war. Adam Schiff in 2020 said, "The United States aids Ukraine and her people, so we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here." This is a common trend throughout history. Sir Edward Grey went to the French in the early 1900s and gave them a war guarantee against Germany. So he was doing them this kind, virtuous, huge favor. However, this war guarantee led to 1.3 million Frenchmen getting killed in the First World War, a global conflict that people to this day will say, well, obviously that was not anything that was justified in the long run. In the late 1930s, Neville Chamberlain gave the Polish military a war guarantee because he was so kind and virtuous to protect Danzig, a place that was roughly 95% German. And as a result of that war guarantee being violated, Britain declared war for Polish independence, and this led to 8 million Poles dying. Giving Ukraine a war guarantee does not benefit the Ukrainians. It benefits Zelensky and his co-conspirators at the expense of everyone else in Ukraine. Same with Russia, who has practiced military conscription and has a draft as well. So the point is we are not being nice, kind, virtuous people when we confiscate money from the domestic population and send it to foreign leaders abroad. Lev, how much time do I have left?
3 minutes, 36 seconds.
More evidence that the U.S. politicians are provoking a conflict with Russia. In October of 2016, Hillary Clinton was on the debate stage and said, "We have 17 intelligence agencies, civilian and military, who have all concluded these espionage attacks on my emails. These cyber attacks come from the highest levels of the Kremlin, and they are to influence our election," more or less claiming that Vladimir Putin has violated the democratic sovereignty of America. This could be a declaration of war. This, of course, was retracted by the New York Times, June 29th, 2017. It was not all 17 intelligence agencies. It was just the DNI, FBI, CIA, and NSA, the four least trustworthy organizations in the West. Later, President Biden went on the debate stage against Donald Trump and said that Vladimir Putin has put bounties on the heads of soldiers in Afghanistan. This statement was retracted quietly much later by the Pentagon. Also, Politico said Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say. More than 50 former intelligence officials signed a letter casting doubt on the provenance of a New York Post story on former vice president's son. So far from the U.S. Seeking diplomacy or seeking peace as far as U.S. politicians go, they have constantly been provoking a war with Russia, vilifying Vladimir Putin. They did the same thing with Saddam Hussein, saying he was buying yellow cake from the Nigerians. They did the same thing with Gaddafi. Susan Rice said he was giving his troops Viagra as a tool for mass rape. Same thing was done by Barack Obama to Bashar al-Assad. So what Putin saw was NATO encroachment expanding beyond where Secretary Baker promised they would, and vilifying him as a tyrannical dictator, which even if you concede he is, I'm happy to concede Saddam, Gaddafi, and Assad are bad people, but regime change on behalf of the U.S. empire is not benefiting these domestic populations, and it's totally unjustifiable to confiscate money from the domestic population and give it to foreign governments to fight wars, which the vast majority of people are obviously against, or else they wouldn't have to enact something like conscription. The Ukrainian National Guard, most recent report I saw, they kidnapped 18,000 men who had tried to escape ever since they were not allowed to leave the country. This is a violation of freedom that far extends beyond forced cotton picking, as bad as that is. Forcing someone to die in a war and get their limbs blown off is so terrible. We should be doing everything diplomatically with Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin to bring an end to this killing, and no more U.S. aid should be given to the Ukrainian regime. Thank you.
Jonathan, your response. And also, if you want to tell people a little bit about yourself beforehand, since you're new to BTR, you can do that as well.
Absolutely will do. And thank you as well to Keith for making it easy for me, because I think we barely agree on anything here. So hopefully I can remember all the points you make. and go through them. I may not be able to hit them one by one. It is important to get a little bit of background here, because a lot of the arguments against intervening in Ukraine are based on concepts of geopolitics. They're based on direct experience as well in places like Iran, Afghanistan. And this is where we might actually be aligned on some of these. Huge mistakes were made in the past in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The attempts to impose so-called democratic values onto people that had really no evolutionary historical process of democracy, no experience of democracy, and no internal organic process of developing either independent judiciary, freedom of press, and the culture of, say, civic society. In Afghanistan in particular, it was a catastrophic and costly failure. And I think that has clouded a lot of people's thinking, and that kind of framework has been transposed onto Ukraine. Why am I so interested in this, though? Because, again, one of the things people say is, well, why focus on this? Why not focus on the Middle East? Why not focus on other things? My background is that I've been interested in Russian history since the age of about 14. I've immersed myself in Russian literature and tried to really understand the Russian mindset, going back to the Russian Empire, and then, of course, the Soviet Empire after that as well. I've also lived in the country during the 1990s, on and off, traveling, studying, working in the 1990s for up to 3 years. So I think it's really important to say that, yes, there are generalizations and there are geopolitical concepts which can be interesting. But when you're confronted by local context, I think it's really important to say, actually, some of these ideas are not actually transposable into that sort of local milieu there, and to understand some of the motives behind the Russian mindset as well, I think is supremely important. Now, there's an interesting phrase here, which is, we may not be that interested, or you may not be that interested about the war. You may not be that interested in Russia, but Russia and war is certainly interested in you. And Vladimir Putin has form on this. It's not that the invasion of Ukraine emerged from nothing. Putin has been positioning himself in an extremely aggressive stance, really not from the very start of his administration, but certainly from the latter period of his administration. You've had a process of internal repression transmuting into external aggression. Once he gained control over the internal domestic situation, then he felt strong enough to turn his attention overseas. Why is this supremely important? Well, you've mentioned NATO an awful lot, and NATO has grown. Expansion almost suggests that it's an aggressive process where countries are coerced into joining NATO. It's part of the NATO constitution that any country has to have a essentially popular support behind joining, and it has to be voted by their representative parliaments. Also, countries can secede from NATO pretty much any time. They are not locked into that alliance. So if it's not in the democratic interests of their people, countries could leave. So rather than saying, why has NATO expanded? It's a perhaps more interesting question to say, well, if it's so bad and if it's so provocative, why have they not left? Because surely if NATO so-called growth or expansion, to put that label on it, was such a security risk to these countries, they'd want to get out as fast as possible in order not to provoke Russia. I would put the argument here that it is not NATO that's the problem. NATO is the one reason why countries in the alliance have not been directly attacked by Russia. Why is Moldova in such a precarious position? It's because it does not have NATO protection. So in fact, not being a member of NATO is the provocation for Russia, because Putin feels he can expand his influence and coercion into those territories and can potentially invade them because they do not have Article 5 coverage. There's a conversation, I think, which was interesting, having it with a senior American general. This thought had not occurred. It seems to me the most obvious thing in the world, but it had not occurred. that NATO is the best protection against a revanchist empire. It's the best protection against someone who's become increasingly dictatorial through his reign, as Putin. Why has it taken this turn, though? Is it because NATO is such a dire threat to Putin, his regime, his internal security? If this was the case, you'd expect the borders with NATO to be absolutely bristling with armaments. You would expect the NATO border, the NATO-Russian border, to be the one where the most kind of hardware and troops are located. But actually, for the majority of Putin's regime, the Leningrad military obelisk was essentially disbanded after the Soviet Union. There's practically no hardware or equipment actually located on the NATO-Russian borders. Why? Because they know full well that there would never be an invasion from NATO territory. They know full well that it's a defensive alliance, and they also know full well that actually NATO countries have been underspending on defense for the better part of 2 decades since the 1990s, almost immediately after the Soviet Union came down. And the US especially pumped money into Russia to support its failing economy and to prevent people from starving. I was there, I saw it. I saw the amount of food aid that was actually sent over to support Russia. So it's an extraordinary situation. You have a country during the Cold War, it's threatening nuclear war. It's the dire enemy of the West. As soon as that regime collapses, what is the first thing that the US does? Well, first of all, it tried to persuade Ukraine not to secede from the Soviet Union. The US tried to keep, and Bush tried to keep the Soviet Union together. It's an extraordinary kind of gesture. Whereas those who are hawkish would argue that actually, no, Ukrainian independence is what you should go for. If you want to be divisive, you wouldn't do what the US did in that case. You send food aid in. Unfortunately, what the US and its allies also did is to send in a bunch of economists to help support reforms in Russia, privatization of its industries, and actually aligned with the idea to create an oligarchic class. The idea was this oligarchic class would form a barrier between the supreme leader and it would be almost like trying to create a kind of a boyar class or a merchant class who would be the first step in moving towards democracy. So this possibly is the criticism you could level here, that the US sort of did interfere to an extent, and there are other Western experts from Europe as well. This isn't a US process alone. And essentially for what is quite possibly good reasons, we helped in the creation of a system which sowed the seeds of the current problems. Because this kind of class of super moneyed, super rich oligarchs have no interest actually in investing in democracy. And because we were able to offer them financial services in the West, legal services, and a conduit for them to get their money out of the country and buy huge mansions in Mayfair, Kensington, New York, etc., we were able to create a structure of rule of law to keep their ill-gotten gains safe. There was no incentive for them to create rule of law or to create institutions of democracy in their own country because they were able to kind of outsource that to us. So if we're going to level any blame, it is in the entirely misguided system that was brought about in the 90s. The rest, however, unfortunately, I don't think we should be taking blame for, because what happened in that process is the KGB that was one of the distinct arms of the Russian government, which was tremendously weakened in the 90s. Well, many of those people went into business, but it wasn't sort of business in the kind of rule of law sense that you might see in the sort of capitalist West. It wasn't backed up by generations of, I would say, culture of rule of law and institutions and so on that try to, let's say, cut the sharp edges off.
I apologize. Your time, Jonathan, is almost up, but we're going to keep going back and forth.
Talked about Ukraine yet?
Yeah, well, that's
very quickly draw that together, though. Ukraine is a rule of law society, and unlike Afghanistan, over the last 30 years, it's been developing a culture of democracy, pushing back against Russification. And I think it's supremely important that that survives and is given the freedom to flourish.
So, Keith, what is your retort? Go for it.
So let's start with Ukraine is a rule of law society. On March 20th of 2022, citing martial law, Ukraine president signs decree to combine national TV channels into one platform, monopolizing the flow of information. Not democratic, not rule of law, not any friend of people who believe in social cooperation or free trade. March 20th, also of 2022, Ukraine suspends 11 political parties with links to Russia. Zelensky says parties such as Viktor Medvedchuk's opposition Platform for Life are aimed at division or collusion. He's also confiscated a great deal of property from the Russian Orthodox Church. This is not democratic. It's not rule of law. It's nothing that we should brag about. His worst crime, I would argue, is Ukrainian males aged 18 to 60 are banned from leaving the country. Zelensky says in new declaration, he said, in particular, it is forbidden for men, so he's a sexist, for men ages 18 to 60, Ukraine citizens, to leave the borders of Ukraine. As I mentioned previously, he has confiscated property from the Russian Orthodox Church. March 31st of this year, he did not hold elections in his sacred democracy, whereas Russia did hold elections. And Ukraine is actually the one who violated NATO borders on November 15th of 2022 when Ukrainian defense missiles bombed Poland and killed 2 civilians. Lord knows what happened with Nord Stream.
Now, there's many different things here. I just want to make sure that we don't go all over the place, that we concentrate on a few. Before Jonathan's response, though, I do have one question for you, Keith. Do you know what the jobs were of the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church during the USSR? Do you know what they were doing, where a lot of those leaders are still active? Like
a lot of them were paid propagandists. What differentiates rule of law?
No,
from
far worse.
Tyrannical...
Far worse than that. Far worse than that.
Okay, well, maybe rule of law consists of massively discriminating against people based on religion. I don't think it does. Even if some of them were involved in that, it does not justify.
Well, they were KGB agents, just to be clear. They were working directly for the KGB. And the question here is that what responsibility would, let's say, Ukraine have towards making sure that people who are still working for what was before the KGB, now the FSB, the Russian secret police, what responsibility do they have towards making sure that those people don't create problems in Ukraine versus religious persecution?
Yeah,
let me tackle this. Yeah.
I'm not sure what percentage of the people who are victims today were involved 30 plus years ago with the KGB. However, it still doesn't justify massive discrimination against people based on religious faith. We have a lot of Orthodox people in America. Just to call them Putin puppets, considering everyone is called a Putin puppet, no matter where you stand on issues, basically, unless you want a complete blank check to Ukraine, it still doesn't justify what Zelensky did.
Let me jump into there, because these are some really important points here. And I have to say you're 100% misrepresented absolutely everything there. So the KGB essentially ran the Orthodox Church in Russia from the point of the 1940s, when Stalin rehabilitated the church as part of a nationalist movement, a sort of nationalist, communist sort of movement, to really try to unite people to defeat Nazi Germany. By that stage, tens of thousands of priests have been shot and tortured to death. So whatever organic spiritual basis the Orthodox Church in Russia had was essentially erased by the 1930s. From that point on, over the decades, to become part of the senior hierarchy of the church, not only were you an informer, and everybody had to be an informer, but the senior clergy were all KGB officers first, priests second. There are some doubts even about whether any of them would actually believe in God or not. The head of the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, there is compelling evidence that he was not just an informer, but actually had a senior rank in the KGB. So we're not talking here about a spiritual organization. That's not to say there are not people who are not spiritual, who are part of the Russian Orthodox communion? Of course there are. It would be, it would be ridiculous to say there aren't. In terms of the function of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and let's focus on Ukraine specifically, it is run like a spy network. So the church primarily is there because it is based in terms of local communities. It gathers intelligence on who is in those local communities. And in wartime, that means basically gathering intelligence on your enemies. So it is an extremely dangerous and divisive network. There was plenty of proof gathered by the Ukrainian state that Russian Orthodox churches were being used in conjunction with the KGB, either directly through priests or in harboring people who are working within those networks. That isn't to say that there isn't an Orthodox communion in Ukraine. Ukraine is an extremely, I would say, spiritual country. It's an extremely religious country. The number of people who go to church is far higher typically in Western Ukraine than in any country in Western Europe. But it also has diversity of churches. You have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which originally was actually, prior to Russia's invasion of Crimea, was actually part of the Russian Orthodox Church. Then in a huge historic schism, it changed its affiliation because obviously it's seen as a threat, not just to the state, but also to the congregations themselves. Now, I think it's important to temper your argument here to say, well, hang on a second. If you're talking about religious persecution, what is happening on the ground? Every Ukrainian has the right to be part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but also has the right to be a Baptist, an evangelical, a Mormon. You can name any number of denominations. There is no evidence or even anecdotal evidence that anybody is being suppressed and prevented from belief. What is happening on the territories that Russia has occupied? There is masses of evidence of hundreds, if not thousands, of believers in the evangelical community, the Baptist community, being kidnapped, tortured, murdered. Over 600 churches in occupied territories in Donbass have been destroyed to their roots, and their congregations either absorbed into the Russian Orthodox Church or else persecuted, deported, etc. So the evidence on the side of persecution that Russia is conducting is massive. The evidence of persecution is there's only one example of it, and that is to say that the Russian Orthodox Church under Kirill is not a spiritual organization, is a network of spies and killers.
Any response to that, Keith?
What it's hard to know which angle to take. So what percentage of the Ukrainian forces would you say are National Socialists who have an allegiance to the former Stefan Bandera?
Well, I don't mean that not yet though, because I want to focus.
Totally okay. It's totally okay.
I'm like a
to
pit
vilify
bull.
people based on religion.
No, I'm like a pit bull that grabs onto the specific subject and doesn't let go, unlike these CNN talking head shows. I don't do that. So when we were talking about the church,
we can put a figure out there: 3%.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of the vote for far right or extreme right parties in Ukraine, they've never polled more than 3% in free and fair elections. That is far, far lower than Italy, France, Germany, almost any Western European country you care to mention. It is a far, far, far lower electoral polling. They have never held office, and as far as I can tell, have never controlled any regional councils. So, of course, there are going to be bad people. I wouldn't even label all people on the right as being necessarily bad. It's just, are they Democrats but hold extreme views that we don't like? Or are they out and out sort of, racists, etc.? I would say I wouldn't even lump them all into the same category. Just as I wouldn't lump everybody in the GOP as being a bad person, or even everybody in MAGA as being a bad person. That wouldn't be fair to them. There is a spectrum, even on the right of opinion, but 3% is tiny compared to any other state in Europe. In Russia, there's a far, far bigger far-right problem, and indeed it is coerced and used by the state to help reinforce the regime.
Including the Rusage Group. But before we get into the Rusage Group and all that, like I said before, I'm going to be a pit bull about this. Keith, do you have any response specifically about what Jonathan said regarding the church, specifically with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as being a church that the believers have, full capacity to go to pray to, while having these problems that Jonathan talked about regarding these FSB, KGB affiliated priests?
My primary source on this was Reuters, October 19th of 2023. Ukrainian parliament votes to ban Orthodox Church over alleged links with Russia. MPs overwhelmingly back in initial vote, despite church claims it has cut ties with Moscow. As far as justifying the Ukrainian regime as a rule of law democracy, this is one of the many cases that I explained, along with martial law, along with banning 11 competing political parties, along with not holding elections this year, along with mass enslavement of men ages 18 to 60. This is my response to his claim that it's a rule of law democracy that we must spend thousands of lives to protect.
Yes, but if we just take this one, and if you, let's say, give the benefit to Jonathan for what he said right now about there being this other church, which I'm also aware of, and the expanded context of what exactly is going on here with the church, would that change, specifically about that, not about everything else, but specifically about that, would it change your outlook on that situation?
That would definitely change the degree of evil that it is to ban an entire religion or church or coercively stop people from engaging in
denomination,
voluntary
not a religion,
faith.
because you can still be an Orthodox. You
A
can still be an
denomination.
Orthodox believer. So a denomination, and the nuance here is it a spiritual organization that is designed to enhance the livelihoods and the freedom of its flock? And the argument here is that it's not. That is specifically designed for other purposes, deeply subversive ones. It's the same with the parties. Now, Ukraine has actually been rather slow to react to a lot of this stuff, far, far slower perhaps than it ought to have been. And in terms of the parties, many people who were part of these parties, but once the evidence is provided of their funding or connections to Russia, it's not that these politicians were all suppressed. Some fled back to Russia. Some fled to Russia to their paymasters. Most of them actually changed their allegiance, joined other parties, and continued their political activities. So we're not talking about a sort of blanket suppression here. We're talking about a country that's fighting for its life, which has demonstrated that certain parts of its polity are funded by the state that has launched a full-scale war against it. It's similar with the oligarchs. Evidence is provided, and these go through courts of law. Ukraine is going through judicial reform, so it's not perfect yet, but evidence needs to be provided that the source of income or even influence for some of these people comes from outside of the country and specifically is linked to the country that's trying to annihilate it. Now, no country on earth, including the United States, would tolerate that. In fact, the US has very explicit laws that its political system should not be corrupted by outside monies, especially if those are designated as, I would say, enemy powers intent on damaging your system and way of life. So Ukraine is only doing exactly what the US would do and has done in the Second World War in similar circumstances.
Now, I want to make sure we get through everything that, Keith, you were talking about right now, because these are important points that you're bringing up. But first, quick question. Is this the first time that you have heard about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, about like this other denomination here that people are able to pray to on this podcast?
No, the research that I've done is with Matthew Raphael Johnson, who is an expert in all things Russia. I leaned on him for a great deal of this, as well as former colleagues of mine, both at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. But the fact that I mentioned it is one of my points to just refute the fact that it's just a rule of law democracy.
No, but did that gentleman mention that other denomination to you? That's my question. Was that
no, not
Okay, well,
not
see,
that.
this is the important thing, though, because this is a real thing that exists. Yet we have the internet. We have all of these connections, like I'm making right now with you and Mr. Fink here, and I find that just to be troubling in and of itself. That we foxholed ourselves so much into not even being aware of certain things that are going on, unless we kind of, dig through the muck and reach out to somebody who's on the completely other side. This is not to say that the things you're aware of, Keith, are not valid. They're extremely valid, but the fact that this was not being made aware to you until now means that there's a lot of work to do. Same thing with Tucker Carlson, because he's always mentioning about Ukraine persecuting, the religion and all that, specifically Zelensky persecuting, without this Ukrainian Orthodox Church even being mentioned once. So to me, I don't know if that's like Adam Carolla likes to say stupid or liar, because you'd expect somebody like that to be well informed of whatever's going on. Yet, before we continue, why do you think we have this disconnect right now, that this was the very first time you have heard of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Because this is one of the smaller points in the larger point of avoiding a war that was intentionally provoked by NATO, where you have Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and Chris Murphy talking about the importance of provoking Putin into a war in Ukraine. So yes, it was one small
Let's address
thing.
that one.
And
yeah,
yes, I don't know everything
about.
about
big point.
I don't know everything about Protestants, Catholics, or Scientologists, but declaring war on them or confiscating large amounts of their property or calling them all informants or saying that Ukraine's government should be outlawed because they've taken money from the Soros Open Society Foundation or the National Endowment for Democracy. I look at them all as very thin justifications for totalitarianism, whether it's Putin, Zelensky, Biden, or anyone else, really. So the only reason I didn't do a huge deep dive into that aspect is because how much time are you going to spend on one aspect of something huge and terrible? We have tens of thousands of deaths that could have been avoided here.
But then
let's jump into Maidan. Jonathan, we got to tackle Maidan, because this is at the heart. All this other stuff is important, and I'd love to talk about why Ukraine's treatment of the Russian Orthodox Church is discussed, but Russia's treatment of Baptists, evangelicals, murder, torture cells on a vast scale, why that's not even mentioned. I mean, that's an extraordinary mission. But let's get to the heart of it, and that is 2014. It's Maidan. It's the revolution that forced Yanukovych out of the country. I say forced. He decided to leave. He decided that he really didn't want to form any kind of consensus government or be involved in a subsequent electoral process. He fled to Russia. Now, why did this happen? And I think this is probably more complex than we can tackle here, but that wasn't the first revolution in Ukraine. It was one of, I think, the sort of third or even fourth revolution that happened in a number of years. And it's a process, a very interesting process, where you did have a divided country. You did have a country of Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. They're part of the same country, but there are nuances and differences in culture from west to east. So let's dismiss the Russian idea that because you speak Russian, you are Russian. That is BS. That is absolute nonsense. How do I know this? I've spoken to many, many dozens of people from Donbass, Russian speakers who've learnt Ukrainian perhaps later in their lives. So this idea that they're not Ukrainian because they speak Russian is absolute kind of nonsense. But there are a lot of similarities and there are a lot of shared culture. Prior to Russia's invasion, in fact, many people would have looked, I would say, with a certain amount of even nostalgia or even warmth on Russian culture. That is all gone. That's been blown out of the way, not by NATO, not by the US, but by Russian aggression. Now, Maidan was a process to prevent the further Russification of Ukraine. Yanukovych was a deeply corrupt leader, but he would have remained in power. He would have remained in power if he hadn't promised one thing in his electoral manifesto and then gone back on it. Everybody in Ukraine understood what was happening here. He had committed the country to closer ties with the EU, not NATO at this point. There was a very small minority of people who were interested in joining NATO. And actually, there was really no prospect of the country joining NATO. There still isn't. And if the US was really serious, and all the stuff you've quoted here, my goodness, the war would already be over. The US would have piled weapons into Ukraine rather than drip feeding just to keep Ukraine in the game rather than being overwhelmed. Ukraine would be in NATO already, would be in NATO years ago if we took this even half seriously, which unfortunately we don't. Maidan is a very different process. It's a recognition that Russia uses mafia informal networks, it uses trade unions, it uses coerced agents, assets, it corrupts people in the administration, the military, to try and control the state. Let's say comparable to some of the stuff the US might have done in the 60s and 70s in Central and Latin America. I mean, you talk to CIA guys, they know what Russia's doing because they know some of these techniques. The technique is to corrupt every institution. The technique is to convince people that organic politics is not going to change their lives at all. So why even kind of bother? The attempt there is to completely coerce and corrupt a country so that it then does your bidding. It does what you want. Putin believed that Yanukovych could suddenly announce that, okay, we're not going to join the EU. That's all done and dusted. I'm going to break all my electoral promises. Everything's going to be fine. Both he and Yanukovych underestimated how far the Ukrainian country, not just the West had come, but how far the whole country had come in developing a strong civil society, a thirst for freedom, an understanding of the benefits of increasing democratization. They rightly saw that Yanukovych was the one mounting a coup. Even though he's elected, he's mounting a coup against the future of the country, against the democratic wishes of the people. And they opposed it, and I think quite rightly. Now, why isn't this a CIA coup? It's because anyone who was involved in Maidan will realize that if America had this power, it would be extraordinary, but it doesn't. It doesn't have the power to impose such a process at scale in the country. Maidan happened because hundreds of thousands of people came out on the streets. They self-organized. They produced kitchens creating food and flags and huge civic networks to bus people in throughout the country. This wasn't just a few people in Kiev or bussed in from Lviv. This was hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country. There were mini Maidans in cities right across Ukraine, including in those areas which Russia later came to try to take over in Donbass and so on. This is an organic revolution, a process. Of course, it's in the US interest. Of course, the US is egging it on, sending people over, observers to see what's going on.
It could even send money to help, right? It could even send money.
It sends money to help as well, of course.
Yeah.
No, Russia sees this as unreasonable interference. In fact, Russia sees any manifestation of civic society as unreasonable interference. It sees any exertion of soft power, any influence, in fact, of America, the US, as sort of toxic. That's their problem. That's their paranoia, not ours, unfortunately. But Maidan is an incredible historic process, comparable to the revolutions of the 19th century that sought to overturn monarchy, comparable to the revolution that the US had that rightly kicked the British out from governing them as well. I find it extraordinary that people who believe in liberty, believe in freedom, believe in a small state and the power of people to self-organize to solve their problems rather than relying on over-heavy governments, why they won't look at what happened in Ukraine and say, oh my God, we need to learn from this because the Ukrainians have innovated and discovered techniques to reverse one of the worst tyrannies in human history, which is the Soviet Union and the sort of Soviet Russification that destroyed every organic institution in every country that it touched. We should be looking at this and saying we have something to learn about freedom, not that we should stand back and see freedom snuffed out by a tyrannical, dictatorial, genocidal, pathological maniac.
Keith, any holes in Jonathan's argument? Go ahead. Whatever you want.
When waging revolution, you have to ask compared to what and at what cost. So the question of it's so vitally important we get Yanukovych out of here so we can get Poroshenko, you have to weigh those costs each and every time. So, for example, I might say as a member of a citizen of the state of Arizona in America, I might say, well, the federal government is not representing us Arizonans. So one way to do that is to start a revolution and have a coup in Washington, D.C., so we could have Arizonan sovereignty. Well, if it involves a negotiation process which allows for troops to be withdrawn or regulations to be limited or more free trade, that's one thing. If it leads to a civil war, which leads to mass conscription and people not being able to leave
Not
the
civil
geographical
war,
area,
not civil war. We've got to tackle the civil war. That is an offensive term to every single Ukrainian. It's a Russian
using the
talking
analogy,
point.
using
It's
the
not
analogy,
a civil war. It's
using
an
the
invasion.
analogy, using the analogy that I was of Washington, D.C. going to war with Arizona, that civil war would be provoked if Arizona or Texas or Florida tried to secede from the Union. Even the most reasonable political candidates would refuse to allow a state to secede. So the whole thing is,
There
yeah,
you go. So
freedom,
Donbass, let's turn that around.
freedom.
Why
So
would
freedom is
Donbass be allowed to secede from Ukraine? Donbass is Ukrainian sovereign territory. Crimea is Ukrainian sovereign territory. Your argument here has basically said, what the hell is Russia doing in there? Why is Russia sending troops, GRU agents in? Why is it sending Buk missile systems, which, by the way, destroyed a civilian European airliner, killing hundreds? Your very argument there is, what business is it of Russians to be involved, sending hundreds, thousands of troops, equipment, money to meddle in another country's sovereign business? That is not civil war. Ukraine is a country. Russia is a country. What's so difficult to understand about that?
It's not that it's difficult to understand. It's how do the citizens in these geographical areas display their preferences? One way is to say, well, they haven't left, and these are the outlines of the current countries. Another way is to take polling and allowing for votes to take place. So in Crimea and in the Donbass region, those areas did not vote to stay with the Poroshenko regime. So that is a better
Rubbish.
indicator.
Absolute
That is a
rubbish.
much better
Absolute
indicator
rubbish.
than
It's rubbish. No one voted to join Russia. No one voted to join Russia. Even in Crimea, a majority of people, it was a slim majority in 1991, voted to become independent, 54%. What you're saying here is absolute nonsense. Nobody voted to join Russia. Nobody. And those polls that were latterly held under occupation were held at the barrel of a gun. They are invalid. So I entirely agree with you. If a free and fair poll were to be held in these areas under the jurisdiction of the United Nations, with proper peacekeepers holding a free and fair vote, that would be interesting. That might be a solution to the problem, to see what people actually want. The challenge now is that the indigenous population of Crimea is not the population that is there now. There are many, many Ukrainians and Crimea Tatars that have been deported, that have been abducted, that have been tortured, and are no longer in that territory. So you're going to poll the people in Crimea who are there now, 800,000 of whom are the colonists imported into the country. That's like saying, before the American Revolution, what if the UK shipped several million people over and force them onto the population? Are you going to allow those votes to count? If someone claims and sort of, comes and inhabits your house while you're away on a holiday, do they have more rights than you do? Because,
in New York,
spend a couple of months in your house.
In New York, unfortunately, they do with the squatting laws.
Okay.
But luckily, I think the inner fire of the Italian Americans, who were involved in the mob, hopefully that's coming back. But that's a whole other conversation. But anyway,
800,000 of these. Yes.
So in 2014, if we had taken a poll, which I believe there was a vote in 2015, I will get the specifics on that. where Yanukovych was heavily favored in Donetsk and Luhansk and the other breakaway provinces, you don't think that they genuinely support, would rather be under Russian rule rather than Ukrainian rule? And is this worth fighting a war over?
Yes. First of all, there would be no war without Russian intervention. Let's make this super, super clear. Ukraine had internal problems, but those problems were entirely solvable peacefully. Donetsk, Luhansk were extremely economically active areas. Mariupol was the fastest growing city in Ukraine. This idea that somehow the East had been entirely neglected, that somehow it's not part of Ukraine, that somehow its future is not part of that wider country, that is absolutely a piece of, unfortunately, Russian propaganda. Now, there are issues. There are issues with people speaking Russian who may have felt a little sidelined. There are sort of issues, economic issues. There are issues of corruption and the, let's say, the distribution of incomes and so on. But one of the interesting radical processes that happened after Maidan was radical decentralization. Extraordinary democratic process that actually deferred a lot of power down to local authorities, down to city, village levels. So there's an extraordinary democratic process that takes place. You also have extremely vibrant economies in the East. Without Russian intervention, there may well have been issues, there may well have been protests, but these would have been contained within civic political protests, processes, as they are in many, many countries. I mean, take Britain, for instance. Britain had a vote on, or rather, Scotland had a vote on independence, and they voted to remain by a small margin within that union. Subsequent to that, Britain then voted for Brexit. That was something that was against the interests of a huge majority of Scots. Now, you can express your discontent in a civil fashion, exactly as Ukrainians are doing. You can say that this union is not benefiting from us, for us, but until you have a legal process that allows the country to split, that is still a unitary state. Even if a majority in a certain part of it do not feel it benefits them, you have to have a legal process to disinter a country. We saw the Czech Republic split from Slovakia. Czechoslovakia split apart in an amicable process because they decided that their best interests were served in doing this. It's a legal structured process. Sending GRU agents in, sending in missile systems, tanks, sending Russian soldiers who are, have their little lapel badges and stuff removed to stoke a war, that is not a civil political protest. And then having votes at the barrel of a gun, which are then cited as the sovereign demand of these people to live differently, that is not valid. It is illegitimate. And right from the start, right from Russia stoking these tensions and confrontations, you cannot talk about organic politics in these areas because Russia's used every trick in the book to threaten, coerce, torture people in those territories.
All right. Since the 2014 and 2015 referendums are illegitimate, you would certainly concede that Zelensky not holding elections on March 31st of this year at all, holding no elections, that obviously is a violation.
It's entirely within the Constitution, as it was in Britain. During wartime, the Ukrainian Constitution explicitly says that you cannot hold elections in wartime unless it is supported by a majority in the parliament. That vote was put to parliament. The debate happened in the Verkhovna Rada, and a majority of Ukraine's political parties and politicians agreed that it was the wrong time to do that, but also agreed that that issue would be revisited on a regular basis. One of the reasons why, there's several reasons why it was agreed that that shouldn't happen. One is that the safety of people voting could not be guaranteed. Why? Because Russia is sending thousands of missiles into the country, glide bombs. It would specifically target electoral centers in the same way it's targeted cultural centers, churches, hospitals. So it was felt that that was an unreasonable risk to the population. It was also felt that the infrastructure to provide a free and fair vote could not happen. One, because A huge number of territories are under Russian occupation, but even those that are on the front line under Ukrainian occupation, you cannot hold the infrastructure and the process to have a free vote that is extended to the majority of people. Also, it was felt that Russia would try to weaponize and manipulate such a process to destabilize Ukraine's war effort. So these are reasons that were widely debated in Ukrainian parliament. That to me is important. The same as the mobilization law that you mentioned as well. If Ukraine was not a democratic country, it would have imposed far strict mobilization far earlier on in the war. Unfortunately, it is a messy democracy and has taken months and months and dozens of drafts of the bill to get anything approaching a law through the parliament. If Zelensky was a dictator, he could have signed that decree literally 2 years ago and called up another sort of 500,000 bodies and throw them into the meat grinder. It is a democracy. He hasn't been able to do that. And it is to Ukraine's detriment, unfortunately, because now it needs more bodies. Russia has mobilized its economy, war economy. Ukraine needs more people in order to defend itself. The alternative, relinquishing itself to Russia, which you mentioned at the start of your introduction, again, I think we need to understand what Russia does when it occupies territories. If Russia was to be allowed to occupy all of Ukraine, you would see that part of the population that could get out move to Europe. You would see one of the largest examples of ethnic cleansing in history, one of the largest migration movements in history. Those who couldn't remain, the elderly, the infirm, the extremely poor, the disabled, I don't even want to think about what happened to them. Bucha Irpin shows exactly what would be their fate. I've spoken to people in Russia who escaped from Mariupol, and I can tell you it is deeply, deeply harrowing, the stories of what Russia does to Russian-speaking residents of cities like Mariupol. It's genocidal.
So one of your worst fears is that the people will leave Ukraine en masse, and I agree that that would be an absolute tragedy, but that would still be more freedom than they have today, where the no-leave order is still in place for all men at ages 18 to 60. So
what kind of freedom is that?
Most
What kind of freedom is
terrifying
that to leave
example,
you?
your most terrifying example of what could happen is a worse thing is already happening with Zelensky.
It's not. No, I mean that's
why can't Zelensky just say it's an all-volunteer army, and if people don't want to fight and die, they don't have to? That's
because
you won't get
enough people. I mean, up to now, and certainly
this is
the
the
women
justification for slavery. This is the worst form of slavery that has ever existed. Military.
So what did the US do in World War II? What did Britain do in World War II? Survival of your very identity as a nation requires that you spend what in peacetime would be normal civil liberties. Otherwise, you do not exist as a nation. You'll be erased. But let's take this isn't the worst case example. Yes, most of the population get to Western Europe. Western Europe is destabilized by the economic and human impact of that. What happens next? What does history show us? Does Putin say, great, I've won, and he stops there and we're all good? No. He's won. A dictator has been appeased, and he's won a massive victory against his enemies, who he sees as weak, decadent, and finished. And if you listen to Russian propaganda, that's how they talk about your country and my country. They see us as weak, decadent, pathetic, and on the way out. What would they do next? Well, they'd move on to Western Europe. They'd move on to Western Europe, and you would see the enslavement of hundreds of millions of people. Ukraine has the second strongest army in Europe. Russia has the first. Unfortunately, I do not believe Germany and other countries would be able to resist a victorious Russia. Russia would co-opt whatever Ukrainians are left in the territory.
Well, especially after the United States,
slave army.
Especially after the U.S. became like a big daddy figure to Western Europe, where Western Europe isn't minding its own business as much as it used to before. After World War II, there was, obviously a threat of, we don't want Europeans' powers to get too strong, yada, yada, yada. But Keith, I would want to, how much time do you have, by the way, because it's 1:33 right now. How are we doing?
If we could do 10 minutes, please. I'm happy to. I really want to make sure that I have made my position clear
Absolutely.
that as evil as I think the Russian government is, all governments, I think the Saudi Arabian regime is evil with Mohammed bin Salman. I still think we should do everything we should to not have a war with Saudi Arabia. The same exact principle I have goes with Putin, because the costs of war are so extremely high, not just monetary, in life and limb and property destruction, and the outcomes are extremely uncertain. Take the World War II example. In March of 1948, Winston Churchill wrote The Gathering Storm, where he said, "The human tragedy reaches its climax, and after all the sacrifices and exertions of millions of people in the righteous cause, we have found neither peace nor security, and we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted." That's the book, and it's
That's
in the
the book.
preface in March of 48. So after tens of millions of deaths, you had communism in China, you had the Bolshevik regime stronger than ever, and had occupied half of Eastern Europe. If you're still going to defend mass military enslavement, 400,000 deaths on the British side, 400,000 on the American, this is not something where the benefits almost ever outweigh the costs. Even in the best examples of the Second World War, Churchill himself, I think, was very skeptical after the bomb stopped flying.
But with the
I think
idea
you've
that
misrepresented him there. I mean, what he's basically saying is Stalin, our ally, is a huge threat. Just imagine for 1 second if Stalin had been allowed to take the whole of Western Europe. The suffering that you have listed would be a rounding error compared to the suffering that Stalin would have inflicted on those conquered territories.
or the question with Hitler, right? Like, as far as whether the America First agenda back before World War II was that America should not involve itself in European affairs. And the question there for you, Keith, would be what would have happened, and I don't want to go too much on the what if, but as far as having some kind of a negotiation with somebody like Hitler who would justify taking territory based on, the presence of native Germans, the question is, much like we talk about with leftists, the more you give them, the more they want to take. How exactly can you have any kind of, how can you have like any line in the sand here if the other party, like Putin, is just going to say, well, I want more or I'm going to nuke you? You're afraid of me nuking you, well, then you better give me this territory, and then it's just going to go on. Like, how do we stop that?
It's important to have red lines which are actually willing to defend. So North Macedonia, I wish them all the luck in the world, but the fact that NATO has signed a pledge to go to war on their behalf, along with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, I wish nothing for the best for those people. But we are reaching a foreign policy bankruptcy where we spent our very first declaration of war, which my opponent here likes to sideswipe, but that was a 20-year war in Afghanistan, which resulted in the Taliban remaining in power after tens of thousands of civilian deaths, after thousands of American lives, after trillions of dollars spent.
Oh,
this was on a very small scale.
That was a disaster. Iraq was a disaster.
And President Bush's first call after the September 11th attacks was from Vladimir Putin reaching his hand out to the Americans, not because he's such a nice guy, because he saw the writing on the wall that the Americans were the global empire. So it really is a matter of drawing red lines to which you're so dedicated to defend. You'll say, well, at what point would other countries be justified in blockading, bombing the country I live in, engaging in assassinations of political leaders? When would that be okay for other people to do to us? You have to then ask, when is it worth doing to other people, and especially if they're engaged in conscription and no leave orders. I think it's the worst freedom violation that we could have.
So, Keith, what's your red line? I want to know Keith's red line.
My initial red line are the borders of my house. As far as what America should defend, it would be the lower 48 states, along with Alaska and Hawaii. That would be worth going to war over. Doesn't justify conscription or taxation, but that would be the justification for people violently resisting.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
I'll come back quickly at that one. Russia is engaged in huge grey zone warfare, but I would say the cost you've outlined, we're not talking about a Second World War here. No one wants to take Moscow. No one wants to go near there. That sort of vast swamp, they can keep it. Like, no one wants that. So what we're talking about here is investing in deterrent. And the Russian mindset, I think, is interesting. It's a bully mindset, but it can be kept in check if we show strength. Showing strength doesn't mean marching in and taking Russian territory. It means supporting Ukraine to protect its sovereign borders. It may not even be able to take the whole of Donbass and so on, but no further taking of territory. Even if that eventually results in freezing the conflict, we need to be adamant that Ukraine will remain intact. Deterrent, investing in allies and partners, the majority of that money ends up going back to US companies. So it's not just handed over to allies, not just handed over to Ukraine. The majority of the 61 billion aid bill actually will end up in revitalizing the US economy. So deterrent is what we should invest in, not being an imperial US or an imperial Europe. The other question I would add in here, you want to protect the US economy, US jobs, etc. Russia, unfortunately, will not leave you alone to do that. Russia, I believe, is intent on disrupting world trade. It's intent on disrupting the world order that the US has built after World War II. That world order is fundamentally built on trade. It's built on commonality of laws. It's built on creating wealth and freedom, probably something we can actually align on. Russia is not built on these things. Its wealth is built on extractive industries, and its interest is in creating an illegal mafia informal environment around the world where its elites can enrich themselves, not its population, its elites. This is a direct challenge to not US hegemony, it's a direct challenge to the US economy, US wealth. If that system breaks down, then I think the US will be in a dire state. Because it's an implicit threat to the US economy. So that's my closing statement there.
Keith, I know you probably have to go soon because it's 1:41, but any final thoughts on what Mr. Fink said, specifically regarding this red line argument? Because, like Thomas Sowell, our hero, always says, there's no such thing as a solution, there's only trade-offs. So the trade-off of not having Ukraine win over Russia, with as much firepower as possible. The trade-off there would be that now Russia, just like any college campus leftist who wants to gain more power over you, will start going into Poland and the Baltics, so on and so forth, because why not? If nobody's going to stop them. So the question for you, Keith, then is, if your red line is your house or, your country, how far is it okay to let the other side expand, to see them growing and slowly having more influence over everything that's going on, kind of like what we have in San Francisco, but on steroids, with Xi Jinping, walking in and all of a sudden all the homeless people disappear, like that kind of soft power influence, I think is slowly going to get to a lot of these leftist politicians that you and I do not like on behalf of Mother Russia, as well as its slave master China. So that's my final thing, but where would your red line change if things of that nature start occurring and you start seeing them?
Maybe my red line would change if we got the cleanliness of Moscow in San Francisco or New York City or anywhere else.
Boy.
I think
not that
better.
one. You didn't go there.
No, Keith, I'm sorry. I have to respond to that. I must respond to that. Russia takes all of the tax money from all the people who don't have places to pee and poo in the majority of Russia. It grabs all of that delicious tax money and it gives it to Moscow and it gives it to St. Petersburg. And that's why those places are really, really good looking while people are suffering from easily preventable diseases elsewhere in Russia. I just had to throw that out.
That's the center of Moscow. Don't even go to the suburbs of Moscow. Oh boy,
I am totally familiar with governments taxing and spending at the expense of some members of the population to benefit the few. That is exactly what Eisenhower warned us about, saying that there are military industrial interests who have a very big incentive to grow their capacities and their wealth and power at the expense of everyone else not valuing peace or security. So, yes, while Russia is bad, I think the greatest freedom violation for people in general is the domestic government that already claims the right to rule them, tax them, regulate them, and conscript them. So I think a much better explanation than Russia's bad and that was the reason that we're getting involved in this was actually put forth by Paul Wolfowitz in 1992 in his Defense Planning Guidance memorandum, where he says, our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. We must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. That was leaked by the New York Times. This is a war to weaken Russia. So I was asked, well, NATO would have put in way more arms and Zelensky would have mobilized on day one. Why didn't they? Because the goal is not necessarily a nuclear war with Russia. It's just to drag them in and make them weak. The same process Zbigniew Brzezinski used with the Soviets in Afghanistan in 1979. We can still have peace. The Soviets shot down an American airline in 1983, killing 269 passengers. The flight was named KAL-007, and Ronald Reagan did not declare war, and the Soviet Empire came crumbling down. Wars are what take down empires. So if we're so worried about losing our influence, the Ottoman Empire fell as a result of war. The Reich under Kaiser Wilhelm fell when he overexpanded and fought a war on two fronts. Same with Hitler, same with the Japanese imperialists, same with the British and French who tried to expand their role, same with the Tsarist Empire in Russia for going to war to defend Serbia. So the wars make us less safe. The costs are way too high, and the outcomes are so uncertain that war should be avoided at all costs, including this one, and Americans should not be coerced into supporting it, and Ukrainians should not be enslaved to fighting it.
They're definitely not enslaved. I mean, if we wanted to weaken Russia, why the hell did we buy all their gas and oil for 30 years? I mean, there's a much simpler solution here. Don't buy their stuff. Let them live in their swamp with no money whatsoever. No, we built Russia's war chest. We built Russia's war chest and we enabled its parasitic mafia elite to get rich and preserve their wealth. We partially created this problem and we gave Russia all the resources and money they needed. Why? Because we thought that would civilize them. We thought by becoming a trading partner, they wouldn't go to war with us. Boy, we got that.
We weren't bigoted enough, Jonathan. That's our problem. We were not bigoted enough. We were too liberal, and we left our... See, this is where you guys could probably agree here, that there are differences between various, groups, yada, 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 not racial, like more of the, passing on values from one generation to another. And unfortunately, the Russian people have been royally screwed from being slaves to the Mongolians for a long time and, being under the czars and so on and so forth. And it's a damn shame, like that song, it's a damn shame. But yeah, it is a damn shame. What I hope is that this conflict is not going to escalate. The only thing that I'm afraid of is that if the U.S. clams itself up, doesn't pay for any military aid anywhere else, how long are we going to give the rest of Europe until the China-Russia axis starts to slowly go in and take over, one piece at a time? America's going to sit back and not do anything. Okay, but then, I don't know, Keith, like, how long would you give America to be able to just, remain there, hold up, while history occurs around it? That's the danger here.
I would give America much less time if it continues to fund the needless wars and inflate the currency to the point where it's not as valuable as it otherwise would. The reason I listed those empires that fell as the result of expansion is you either have to tax the population or, more commonly, inflate the currency to the point where it's worthless in order to pay for all of these things. And so immediately, once this war goes down, well, then we have to make sure that whoever sits on the throne in Taipei is someone much more favorable to the U.S., even though in 1964, Chairman Mao made it clear that he had a nuclear weapon, and within a decade, Nixon and Kissinger were shaking hands in Beijing. They can still make that alliance. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were willing to shake hands with Stalin after the atrocities of the Holodomor, which far exceed anything Putin's done. And they say we can't shake hands with Putin and Lavrov. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. They're intentionally provoking a conflict to weaken Russia, and it's coming at the cost of too many innocent lives.
If they held out a hand, I'm sure there'll be someone to shake it, but that's not happened yet. Let's see if Russia feels that it's in its interest to talk peace. There's no evidence of that so far.
One final thing I should just say, and we're going to go then. There was this document that was talked about, like the peace document in these negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And the guy who was later on, I'll give you his name, I just remember it. The guy was talking about how during those negotiations, the stipulations that Russia had was that Ukraine was had to reduce its army to the kind of size that it's completely negligible, that it's completely incapable of ever defending itself. While, let's say, if we probably didn't do that whole deal with Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal to Russia, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation today. You know, like they say, good fences make good neighbors. So, yeah, unfortunately, there were a lot of bad decisions that were made, probably from Western naivete. I hope for the best. I don't want these powers like Russia and China to start encroaching more and more into our lives. But I also understand Keith's point of view when it comes to taxation and all that there is a lot of bad problems happening in government. Government's going to overspend on things and yada, yada, yada. And that's a shame too. But I do want to continue these kind of conversations going forward. I would love to have both of you guys back on whenever you would be interested in. The only thing that I would ask Keith, the whole thing about the religious persecution, please look that up. I could send you links. And if you, not us, if you are convinced that we're correct on that whole thing, you know, with the church, it would be good for that to be known, you know, so that could just be like dropped out and say, okay, all the other stuff I could talk about, but this one I'm convinced is BS. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore. You know, just for the sake of truth.
Yeah, if there's something you think is worthy of looking into, I would trust your word on it. When it comes to massive discriminatory measures against people based on religion, whether it's Protestant, Catholic, or Ukrainian Orthodox, that is just not something anyone who cares about freedom or rule of law should ever support, even if it's done under the guise of helping
Orthodox is not
people.
being persecuted. Ukrainian Orthodox
Or
isn't the
Russian
one.
Orthodox.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's the...
yes.
Yeah, even if... Well, okay, we're not going to get...
And
that
Protestant
again, yeah.
wasn't either. What I was doing was using examples.
Yes, I understand.
Yes.
All right, guys.
I mean, the congregation's not persecuted at all. So let's be clear as well. And please do share some instances of the suppression in occupied territories by Russia and how the church actually in those occupied territories is participating in the repression. I think it's, you know, I'm a fervent atheist, but I think, you know, religious suppression, torture is a vile thing which should be fought.
But you know what's not a vile thing? Biltong. Guys, go to biltongusa.com or antonsusa.com and get delicious biltong. When you type in BTR at checkout, you are going to get free shipping on biltong, which if you don't know what that is, Jonathan, you may know if there's like a South African connection.
I know what that is.
Yes, it's a delicious South African jerky. It's beef, bison, and now I think they're coming out with, hopefully I'm going to get some venison as well. So a lot of nutritious, delicious flavors. It's good for keto, carnivore, all that good stuff. So again, guys, I'm going to provide the link in the description as well. But if you guys want to have delicious, nutritious biltong, go to antonsusa.com or biltongusa.com. And I'm going to have the link right in the chat over here as well to antonsusa.com. So go there right now. And any links that you guys want to share, any projects you guys are working on, let's start with Keith before you go, buddy.
This is the recent book I published, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. Check that out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or you can get a free PDF at libertarianinstitute.org.
And Jonathan, what do you got cooking up in the kitchen there?
So I'm currently working on turning a number of interviews in the channel into a book format, which is due to come out in October this year. That's a new thing for me. It's first kind of book, but it'll have some well-known sort of guests appearing there, like Fiona Hill, Keir Giles, and many others. If you sort of follow the war and commentary in there, so that's a pretty big project for me. I'm also planning. I did an event in Ukraine last year in August, and potentially planning to do another event later this year with Ukrainian speakers, experts, historians, journalists, being the guest speakers at those.
And if people want to support you, where do they go?
Follow the channel, follow the community pages. Got buy me a coffee there, but just follow the community pages and everything that's coming up is usually announced ahead of time there.
Silicon Curtain. That's where you go on YouTube, Silicon
That's
Curtain. Why is it called Silicon Curtain, by the way?
The idea there, of course, we had the Iron Curtain. It's a physical divide in Europe between tyranny and democracies during the Cold War. Well, Russian propaganda is now ubiquitous through the tools of social media. You could be sitting on the loo with your mobile phone, and Russian propaganda is being piped into your mobile device. So essentially, the division between tyranny and those who aspire to democracy is now ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
The only final thing I would add to that, on behalf of what Keith is doing, which I think is very important, because even though I'm not a big L libertarian, I do consider a lot of the things that Keith talks about, as well as Dave Smith and people like that, to be extremely important as far as personal sovereignty and making sure that government tyranny does not rule over our lives. I think that's very important, and what I hope can be accomplished through these conversations is, like I said before, that we are able to hear all the arguments from the opposing side and try to really figure out, like, not this is something that I believe in right now, but does this actually make sense? If I were to be in this position, would I make any different decision? And if so, why? And I hope, like, for the people who are listening to this, we all come to the best decision that's possible here, and that we're not in these enclosed circles. Because, frankly, I think a lot of people who support Ukraine tend to be a little bit negligible when it comes to certain problems going on in the West. Certain problems, let's say even like with migration, even though Putin's the guy who's also been sending a lot of migrants into Europe and the United States, because the Mexico embassy of Russia has way more people in there than the embassy in Brazil, mind you, even though it's a lot smaller. So there's like a whole other thing there. The point is that we, I think, at the end of the day, will agree on way more than we disagree on when it comes to the kind of society Keith and Jonathan want to live in at the end of the day. So, gentlemen, I really appreciate you guys being here. And if you guys enjoyed the program, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, click the bell. The bell is very, very important. And let's keep this conversation going. Break the rules. We bring everybody together here.